This is a BBC podcast. You can get all our podcasts and our terms of use at bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
BBC World Service. I'm Mike Williams, and this is The Why Factor. Today, a simple question, but a potentially controversial one. Why are there homosexuals in the world? My question is not, do you approve of same-sex relations? It's not, what do your religious texts say about it? It's not about politics or faith or tradition or morality. It's about the reality of life for many millions of people across the planet, and it's an attempt to understand the origins of that reality. We're doing something different this week. I'm joined in the studio by three guests: the writer and feminist campaigner Julie Bindel, also Dr. Kazi Rahman. He's senior lecturer in the Department of Psychology at King's College London. But I'd like to start with Stephen Wall, Sir Stephen Wall. He's been a pillar of the British diplomatic and political establishment. Among many other things, he was an advisor to two British Prime Ministers and the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Westminster here in London. He lives in the city with his wife, and they have a son who's in his 30s. 4 years ago, Sir Stephen, you told your wife you were gay. You came out and you later announced it publicly. Tell me about your first sexual experiences.
Well, my first sexual experience with people of the same sex, and only one for the next 50 years, was as a boy of 10 years old at school, at an English Catholic boarding school. You know, I was 10. It was hugely exciting. It was something I'd never felt before. But, of course, we were found out, and I was asked to name my fellow conspirators, if that's the right term, and was too frightened of being beaten, which was the practice in those days not to do so. And so I became the school pariah as a result. So for me, the excitement that I had had was overlain by guilt and the association of trauma. So basically I kind of closed down on the issue of my sexuality. And although by my late teens, certainly by the time I was at university, I knew I was attracted to men and not women, I tried very hard to persuade myself that this was just a phase or whatever. So I spent 20 years in denial. I did then fall rather heavily for a work colleague in my late 30s, but he was straight, so nothing came of it. But after that, I couldn't kid myself that I wasn't gay. But I then suppressed it until, as you say, 4 years ago, I came out. Well, to be truthful, I was outed. My wife found some gay magazines and said, "What's with these magazines?" So I said, "I think I've known all my adult life that I'm gay."
Do you think you were born gay?
For a long time, I thought that the fact that my first sexual experience was with people of my own sex had kind of conditioned my sexuality. Now, in the light of various bits of evidence, I'm not sure. I mean, if I think back, I know these are stereotypes, but I was in many ways the stereotypical gay kid, hopeless at sport, couldn't catch a ball, all those things. So, I now think, did I enjoy it so much because that was the way I already was, rather than did I become gay because I had had this sexual experience?
Well, we're going to explore that as we go on. I'd just like to ask you, before that though, about reaction of friends and family to your announcement that you were gay. Family first, your wife.
Although I think she had had some suspicions, for her it was a great shock. She felt both angry and betrayed. And for both of us, it remains the elephant in the room. We obviously had to renegotiate the basis of our marriage. I couldn't put the genie back in the bottle. On the other hand, when you've lived with somebody for 30 years and you do love them and friendship and companionship are there, that's what we work on. My son, who was then about 30, burst into tears and said, "Dad, I thought you were going to tell me you'd got cancer. It's cool to be gay." And he said, "Now I think about it, you were never exactly the macho role model." As far as friends are concerned, for some it's just it's a minor object of gossip. I've not had anybody express recriminations. So, I think I'm lucky to have been able to come out in a society which is very tolerant compared with the situation when I was in my youth, joined a Foreign Office where you couldn't actually be a member of the Foreign Office and be gay.
Stephen says that he's known all his adult life that he was gay. Dr. Kazi Rahman, does that chime with your experience as a gay man?
Yes, both as a gay man and also in terms of the research too. Stephen said a few things which are indicators of, if you like, an early origins to sexual orientation. So he describes things like gender non-conforming behaviour from as early as you can remember, and then the beginnings of romantic, perhaps, infatuations with other men, which can start quite early on at about 8 or 10 years of age. It's interesting, he describes a lack of interest in things like rough and tumble play, in those kinds of competitive sports. Those things are quite strong predictors in childhood for adult homosexuality.
You've co-written a book, Born Gay, the psychobiology of sex orientation. Help me out here, because there seems to be an evolutionary conundrum. If there is a genetic component to homosexuality, and given the fact that gay men and lesbians are less likely to produce offspring than heterosexuals, why does homosexuality persist?
The current theory is that gay genes, or genes for sexual orientation, what we call alleles, confer an advantage to heterosexual carriers. So effectively what these genes do is they hitchhike in heterosexuals. They confer some advantages, and those will be reproductive advantages, perhaps particularly to female carriers of those genes.
Like what?
And they might be things. So if we consider a very simple version of a gay gene will simply be a gene which makes you attracted to men. The expression of a gene which makes you attracted to men in otherwise heterosexual women makes complete sense. And occasionally it may be expressed in her male relatives, one or two here and there. The reproductive advantages that are conferred to that woman by having that allele will offset the disadvantage, in quotes, to her brother or her later male relatives happening to be gay. So evolution works on a trade-off system. Some genes are beneficial to certain carriers, and if the benefit is greater than the disadvantage, again in quotes, then evolution will maintain those alleles. And that happens for a whole host of traits that we know. So it's not an unusual mechanism.
You think the roots of homosexuality can be found in biology?
Absolutely. I think people are born with a sexual orientation, be that homosexual, heterosexual, bisexual, and to some extent even asexual. And there are other biological factors too.
We'll come to that a little later. I just want to bring in Julie here. Julie Bendel, writer, cultural critic, feminist, author of a book to come out soon called Straight Expectations. Incidentally, a lesbian too. What do you make of Kazi's biological explanation for sexual orientation?
How on earth can one be born gay? I mean, I don't remember fancying the midwife. I definitely think that experiences, opportunities, and maybe a mix of other factors can determine which route you take. So, for me as a feminist, I think that sexuality and sexual orientation is as socially constructed as gender roles.
Kazi?
When biological scientists say you're born with a trait, what they're not saying is you, of course, have it fully fledged. And, of course, babies don't have fully fledged sexual orientation. We're talking about the wiring or the biological precursors for the traits being set before birth. And that can happen for a whole host of things: intelligence, creativity, your propensity to have a psychiatric problem. Those are not fully fledged in a child, of course not. They develop over time. I think there's an interesting point there about development. Stephen's experience is one where he probably had some instinct towards same-sex orientation, as do heterosexuals towards the opposite sex, but his expression of his sexual orientation is the critical issue there. And that, I would agree, and most researchers do, the expression of sexual orientation, our overt behaviour, who we actually physically have sex with, the cultural pressures that are there on gay men and lesbian women to have heterosexual relations, is a social construction. I'm interested in the enduring feeling, the internal instinct towards sexual orientation.
Stephen?
I mean, I personally think that if we can have scientific knowledge, it's better than not having it. But I certainly wouldn't want that knowledge on the basis of now I can prove that I'm not aberrant. I don't think I'm aberrant. I think society has been aberrant towards gay and lesbian people, just as in the Middle Ages it was aberrant towards innocent women who were burnt at the stake as witches.
I have a real hostility to and problem with those who apologise for their sexuality, if we're lesbian or gay, and say we can't help it. Now, for me as a feminist who looks at the constrictions and the oppression of sexuality for women and girls, which we see through female genital mutilation, forced marriage, it's important for me to look at the choices that women have and the way that heterosexuality for women under patriarchy is often left wanting.
Kazi, what's the prevalence of homosexuality? We often hear this figure of 1 in 10 bandied about.
Yeah, the 1 in 10 is a misrepresentation of the pioneering work of Alfred Kinsey, the famous American sex researcher. but very well conducted population level studies show that the prevalence of homosexuality is about 2% or so. So the 10% idea is a complete myth.
Is it possible to get a sense of whether or not that 2% is uniform globally?
Not very well. So there are studies performed in cultures which might be considered less positive towards non-heterosexual orientations, places like Thailand, Brazil. There are some studies in China, and the rates are roughly equivalent.
You're listening to The Y Factor on the BBC World Service. I'm Mike Williams, and I'm talking to Sir Stephen Wall, Dr. Kazi Rahman, and Julie Bindel. All about a very simple question. Why are so many people in the world sexually attracted to members of their own sex? The topic is often fraught. It gets tangled up with politics and morality and religion and fear, distaste, even with disgust. But the issue is live. The upcoming Winter Olympics in Russia have highlighted great intolerance towards homosexuals in that country. And recently, one of Africa's most prominent writers, Binyavanga Wainaina, has come out as gay. It makes it difficult for him to travel across the continent. New laws against homosexuality in Nigeria mean he could face 14 years in jail. In Uganda, the sentence is life. For the purpose of this discussion, we've brought you together, three homosexual people, but there will be people listening who feel very strongly that your way of life is wrong. Stephen, have you met those people?
Well, I mean, as you said in your introduction, I worked for the Catholic Archbishop of Westminster for a year. He was a lovely guy. But I thought, not on this particular issue, but in general, I could help the Catholic Church become more liberal. Some mistake, surely. But yeah, and I spent years thinking it was a sin. I have to say that after I came out, even my wife would say that I'm a nicer person to live with than I was before. I felt for the first time in my life that I was living within the skin I was meant to live in. And now that I have, experience as an adult, sex with other men, I just feel that for me, this is absolutely what is natural and normal. And I would say there's a kind of innocent enjoyment to it. There's nothing about it that makes me feel in any way guilty.
Yet many people do find it objectionable. Julie, your experience?
When I came out in the 1970s, there was horrific prejudice and bigotry. I've been beaten up. I've been threatened with sexual assault and, in fact, been sexually assaulted. So I've seen it, and I've seen it today with young people who come out, although things are undoubtedly better.
Kazi, is it a uniquely human trait?
Homosexual behaviour is widespread in the animal kingdom. However, consistent homosexual behaviour is unique to humans and a few other animals, among them, strangely, some sheep and also some birds as well, where they pair bond effectively, as humans would do. So consistent, enduring same-sex orientations are mostly a human phenomenon.
Julie, why do you so vehemently reject this biological determinism?
Because I think if you are born gay, and if there are a set of gay genes, then there also has to be a gene that determines your gender behaviour, which renders the whole feminist theory and project completely useless and pointless. Because I would say that gendered behaviour, girls playing with dolls, girls wanting to play hockey rather than rugby, boys liking rough and tumble, boys liking to be strong and in control, they are social constructs that serve a patriarchal project. So if it's true, as Kazi says, that one indicator of being gay or lesbian is that you are gender non-conformist, what he's actually suggesting is that it's natural for girls to like pink and it's natural for boys to like rough and tumble.
So you're rejecting his evidence because of your political views?
It's not that. It's that if there is a set of genes or a biological basis, then what that means is feminists may as well give up.
Kazi, what's your view on that?
Gendered behaviour is strongly genetic. In fact, gender nonconformity has a stronger genetic component than sexual orientation per se, although the relationship between the two things has certain biological pathways. But when we say that, what we're not saying, we're saying things like rough and tumble play. We're not talking about, for example, preferring pink or blue. That has a poor biological basis and might well be just nonsense. But there are certain components of gendered behaviour which are biologically based, strongly biologically based, and those influence later sexual orientation.
Kazi, we've spoken a lot about the genetic components, but is that the only way that we might consider understanding how a homosexual is born?
Genetics explains about 30% of the variation in sexual orientation, so genes are not the whole story. Other factors like prenatal hormones during early life in the womb seem to influence sexual orientation. In the case of men, there is this phenomenon called the big brother effect, where gay men tend to have more older brothers.
How does it work?
So one idea is that with each succeeding male fetus that a woman carries, her body forms, if you like, an immune reaction to particular kinds of male proteins in the brain. And so as she carries male fetuses, the brains become more feminized. And there's no social explanation for the big brother effect. It only occurs for biological siblings. It doesn't occur, for example, for adopted siblings. Also, we know that the birth weights in gay men with more older brothers are significantly lower than those without. So that ties the effect directly to the prenatal environment, because birth weight is not influenced by postnatal factors. We know that hormones play a role. We know from good animal models that hormones play a role in both male and female homosexual behaviour. We know from studies of humans who have endocrinological problems, for example, women who have a condition called congenital adrenal hyperplasia, where they're exposed to high levels of the male hormone androgen during early fetal life, will show higher rates of lesbian sexual attractions and fantasies.
Stephen, do you have any older brothers?
No, I have 2 older sisters. My mother was one of 5 sisters. I don't know whether that's a relevant factor, but I have no brothers.
1 in 7 gay men probably owe their sexual orientation to the big brother effect. So the key
1 in
thing
7.
here, about 1 in 7. So, there are different routes to same-sex orientation. They're biological, but there are different routes. And men and women are, of course, different. Those same factors, for example, the big brother effect, doesn't occur for lesbian women.
Julie is desperate to come in here.
It just sounds to me like the factors that you're describing are things that have gone wrong.
No, not at all.
So an exposure to something that others wouldn't necessarily be exposed to. I mean, I've seen all kinds of ideas about how you determine lesbians.
As we approach the end of the programme, I'd like to move from the political, biological and statistical to the personal and come back to you, Stephen. How do you and your wife live together these days?
As friends, we share the house and we share our social life. But once I came out, I was clear, and she generously has accepted that there was going to be a sexual component to my life as a gay man.
Do you have regrets about the way that you lived your life, denying for so long the reality of yourself?
Yes, but you can drive yourself mad by thinking about the what-ifs. I'm much happier to think that I did finally what I think, however painful for my wife, is actually the right thing. Clearly, if she had known I was gay, she wouldn't have married me. If I'd been open about my being gay, things would have been different. On the other hand, although I've been stressed, I haven't been unhappy, and we have a wonderful son whom we both love, so there are huge, huge pluses.
Thank you all. Thanks to Julie Bindel, Kazi Rahman and Stephen Wall. And thanks very much to you for listening. The email address is yfactor@bbc.com.
There are dozens of different podcasts now available from the BBC, including news, documentaries, science, business, arts and sport. For details of them all, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.